Millions of Americans stared at the untouchable Sundance smile on a 40-foot silver screen, crowning Robert Redford the flawless, masculine ideal of the 1970s. The studio executives sold him as the golden boy of cinema, a creature of perfect blonde hair and an impenetrable aura of cool confidence. They built a massive financial empire on that steady gaze, forcing the public to bow to the illusion of his absolute perfection. But the golden boy was already a ghost. He secretly held on to a set of worn brass keys from a cramped 1950s California apartment, locking away a devastation the studio system refused to let him mourn. Those heavy brass keys belonged to a time before the cameras started rolling, before fame extracted every ounce of his humanity. You look at the glossy magazine covers from that era and see a man who conquered the world, a man who possessed everything the American dream promised. I look at those exact same photographs and see a high-functioning prisoner performing a meticulously choreographed lie. The public saw a quiet strength. The reality was a silent suffocation. He was a man hollowed out by a trauma so severe it shattered his foundation long before the world ever learned his name. How did the ultimate symbol of freedom become a captive to his own mythology? To understand the architecture of this tragedy, the narrative must return to the dirt and the desperation of the late 1950s. Before the public relations machine mandated a polished mythology, a restless young painter wandered without a center of gravity. He traveled aimlessly through Europe trying to find a purpose, drinking heavily in cheap taverns, missing crucial opportunities, and drifting entirely without direction. The studio fixers would later try to erase this messy, uncertain version of him from the historical record, replacing the confused young man with a fabricated origin story of inevitable greatness. The truth was far less glamorous and infinitely more desperate. He was slipping rapidly through the cracks of a normal life, staring into the abyss of complete mediocrity, until Lola Van Wagenen provided the anchor. She was intelligent, fiercely grounded, and completely indifferent to the superficial allure of celebrity culture. They married in absolute obscurity, counting spare change in tiny rented rooms, while building a raw reality the cameras did not care about. There were no flashbulbs waiting outside the church, no aggressive agents plotting a calculated path to stardom, just two young people trying to survive the crushing pressure of poverty in California. They shared a suffocatingly small apartment, where those brass keys rattled in a faulty lock every single night. The early years of their marriage were a brutal, unrelenting test of physical and emotional endurance. He studied acting while taking degrading small jobs just to keep the lights on, facing a constant wall of rejection from casting directors who saw nothing special in his face. He pumped gas, he cleaned up after other people, he did whatever was necessary to bring a few crumpled dollars back to that tiny apartment. The pressure was constant. The unpaid bills were piling up on the small kitchen table, and success felt impossibly far away. The nights in that apartment were filled with the quiet anxiety of two young people trying to figure out how to pay for basic necessities. The future was entirely blank, and the industry ignored his existence completely. He was a nobody. Lola believed in the man before the industry ever assigned a financial value to his face. She saw the crippling insecurity, the intense fear of failure, the long and agonizing periods where a stable career seemed like a foolish delusion. She stood in that cramped kitchen, holding the reality of their life together, while he went out every day to face another round of rejections. She was the steady center he desperately needed to stop wandering, the only person on earth who knew the flesh and blood instead of the glossy product. They were building a real family in the quiet shadows of a city that normally devours the weak, protecting each other from the constant anxiety of having nothing. This tiny, impoverished space was the foundation of his entire existence. It was the only place where he was allowed to be entirely human, without a director shouting action, without a script dictating his emotions, without an audience demanding his charm. He would come home, put those brass keys on the table, and shed the thick armor he had to wear in the audition rooms. The love they shared was rooted deeply in the grit of ordinary survival, forged in empty bank accounts and shared fears. It was real, it was dirty, and it was entirely theirs. But an ordinary life is the exact thing the Hollywood machine refuses to leave intact. The destruction of this quiet sanctuary reveals the true predatory nature of the entertainment industry. It is a massive, unfeeling system designed to consume ordinary happiness, strip away personal peace, and convert human connection into a highly profitable spectacle. Subscribe to the channel to witness how the studio machine dismantled this fragile piece, weaponized an unimaginable trauma, and forged an American icon out of pure agony. The descent into the Hollywood nightmare is about to begin. The studio system identified a highly profitable commodity and immediately initiated an industrial-scale extraction of his privacy. Executives weaponized his quiet charisma to sell tickets to millions of strangers, forcing back-to-back productions, while the physical distance from his wife stretched into agonizing months. He belonged to the lens now. The Broadway producers noticed the raw magnetism first, pulling him into grueling rehearsal schedules that kept him away from his home. The television casting agents realized audiences could not look away from his face, booking him for endless guest appearances that completely shattered his personal life. The machinery of fame activated with brutal efficiency, locking him into a trajectory that allowed zero room for human error or emotional rest. The studios offered larger films, legendary directors, and massive financial expectations that crushed any remaining sense of a normal life. They demanded his complete surrender to the image they constructed for the masses. The reality of a working actor in that era was a heavily monitored existence. The fixers and publicists controlled the narrative with an iron fist, feeding the press carefully curated stories of his rugged charm, while aggressively hiding the crushing exhaustion that defined his daily reality. Alongside the suffocating studio contracts binding him to multiple pictures, alongside the grueling 18-hour shooting schedules that drained his physical health, alongside the relentless promotional tours across foreign continents, the industry systematically isolated him from the tiny apartment where he was truly known. They stripped away the struggling young man and manufactured a flawless American phenomenon. The process was cold, calculated, and entirely devoid of empathy. The studio executives operated like a cartel, treating human beings as disposable assets on a balance sheet. The year 1969 cemented his fate permanently. The massive success of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid transformed him from a working actor into an absolute obsession overnight. Women across the country saw the perfect man on the silver screen. The executives saw a perpetual money-making machine that needed constant fuel. He was no longer a husband returning to his family after a long day of work. He was a highly valuable asset, managed by aggressive agents, relentless publicists, and studio bosses who demanded total control over his every movement. The physical toll was absolute, unrelenting exhaustion. The mental toll was a total detachment from his own identity. He lived in sterile hotel rooms. He lived on chaotic movie sets. He lived everywhere except the home he built with Lola. The public demanded endless pieces of his soul, and the studios gladly sold them for incredible box office returns. The glamour facade blinded the entire world to the brutal mechanics operating just behind the silver screen. Yet the true fracture tearing his marriage apart did not start on a movie set. Millions of strangers bought tickets to extract an intimacy from his face that he no longer possessed at home. He fortified himself behind relentless activism and the Sundance Institute, using ambition as a shield against the silence waiting in his living room. The golden boy was already a ghost. He poured every ounce of his remaining energy into creating a sanctuary for independent filmmakers, directing complex feature films, and championing environmental causes with fierce dedication. The adoring public interpreted this relentless drive as the mark of a true artistic genius. The dark reality was a desperate attempt to outrun the suffocating emptiness that consumed his private hours. He threw himself into the demanding work of directing because the chaotic environment of a film set was easier to manage than the quiet devastation of his own home. The long marriage began to rot slowly from the inside out, decaying quietly under the blinding lights of global fame. Lola valued stability, quiet family dinners, and grounded routines that kept them tethered to a normal reality. He increasingly belonged to constant movement, frantic creative escape, and the endless reinvention demanded by his own massive success. The silence between them grew louder than the roaring applause of millions. They were living in completely different emotional universes, separated by a massive canyon of unspoken pain and physical absence. The man who once shared a cramped apartment now existed on a scale far beyond ordinary domestic rhythms. He was a global symbol of freedom to the world, but he was drowning in the heavy obligations of his own mythology. The emotional distance stretched agonizingly across 2 decades of missed conversations, canceled dinners, and permanent physical absence. Heartbreak does not always arrive through one loud, dramatic betrayal that tabloids can photograph and exploit. The most devastating endings happen through the slow accumulation of absence, through the steady erosion of connection under the immense pressure of global fame. He tried to rebuild his fractured identity through constant work, but the work only accelerated the total collapse of his marriage. The studios did not care about the man slowly disappearing behind the iconic characters. The executives only cared about the ticket sales generated by his golden aura. The woman who stood by him during the days of crushing poverty watched helplessly as the industry consumed the man she loved. She carried the heavy burden of ordinary reality while he floated further into the isolated, oxygen-starved atmosphere of superstardom. The pain was quiet, unrelenting, and completely invisible to the adoring public who thought he had a perfect life. There is a profound loneliness in being married to a cultural symbol. Millions of women stare at his face in darkened theaters, falling in love with a carefully manufactured fantasy, while the real wife is left carrying the mundane realities waiting just behind the screen. Over time, that massive imbalance creates an emotional exhaustion that neither person fully understands while it is happening. By the time the realization hits, the life once shared is already too far away to ever reach again. He was trapped in a golden cage of his own making, unable to bridge the massive gap between his public image and his private devastation. The trauma reshaped him into a machine that only knew how to work, how to perform, and how to hide. Does the systematic destruction of a human soul justify the creation of a cinematic legend? Leave a comment below with your unfiltered thoughts. The relentless obsession with work was never just artistic ambition. It was a desperate anesthetic applied directly over the sudden and inexplicable death of his infant son, Scott. The young couple woke up in that cramped apartment to a silence that permanently shattered their entire world. Sudden infant death syndrome stole their child and left behind a massive void that no amount of cinematic glory could ever fill. The loss devastated them completely. Instead of allowing a father the space to collapse, the entertainment machine identified his numb detachment as a highly marketable asset. The executives saw a man too exhausted to fight back. They fed him more scripts, pushed him onto more sets, and forced him to bury his dead son under a mountain of flashbulbs and premiere parties, alongside the brutal filming schedules demanding his constant presence, alongside the heavy promotional tours across foreign continents, alongside the aggressive agents pushing for higher box office returns. The studio machine systematically denied him the time to heal. They rewarded his emotional suppression with global stardom. His profound grief became the exact fuel the industry needed. The studio fixers actively discouraged him from speaking about the tragedy publicly. A grieving father did not fit the rugged and carefree image they were aggressively selling to millions of adoring fans. They needed the ultimate cinematic hero, not a shattered man crying over an empty crib. He buried the trauma deep inside, building a fortress of silence that eventually locked out his own wife. The industry operates as a massive emotional vampire, draining the real pain of the stars to project a profitable illusion onto the silver screen. The public fell in love with his trademark quiet intensity on screen. They did not realize they were watching a father actively drowning in unprocessed grief. He threw himself into the chaotic machinery of Hollywood because stopping meant he would have to sit in the deafening silence of his own living room. He became the face of American cinema, while his soul remained permanently trapped in the exact moment his son stopped breathing. Lola watched the man she loved slowly disappear into the characters he played, powerless to stop the machine that was consuming him alive. The two people who survived poverty and the death of a child together were finally ripped apart by the relentless gravity of his fame. The marriage did not explode in a sudden tabloid scandal. It bled out slowly over 25 years. The divorce in 1985 was the final quiet casualty of a trauma that Hollywood refused to let him process. The Golden Boy was already a ghost. When the cameras finally stopped rolling decades later, what remained in the dark? At the end of his life in 2025, the massive box office records and the sprawling Sundance empire offered completely cold comfort, compared to the memory of the woman who actually knew his true face. When the news of his passing broke, television networks immediately replayed the exact same pristine images audiences had worshipped for decades. They celebrated the flawless blonde hair, the sharp smile, and the effortless masculinity that defined an entire era of American film. The obituaries praised his immense contributions to independent cinema and his unwavering environmental activism. The reality behind the closed doors was an aging man quietly revisiting the only person he should have held on to longer. Lola Van Wagenen was not simply a relic of his distant past. She was the final living connection to the human being he had been before the industry turned him into a heavily managed product. Hollywood loves to build monuments to the most profitable stars, but it actively ignores the graveyards left behind in their wake. The legacy of Robert Redford is undeniably massive, shaping the very foundation of modern cinema. But beneath the awards and the endless accolades lies a profound silence. He spent his final years looking backward toward the quieter chapter of life that existed before celebrity complicated his existence forever. He spoke warmly about nature, simplicity, and the grounded reality he once shared with the woman who loved him when he was still an uncertain painter. Fame changes time itself inside relationships, forcing one person to evolve under blinding public scrutiny, while the other remains anchored in the quiet reality of a shared home. By the time the applause finally fades, the life a person once fought so desperately to protect is already gone. The world saw a legendary actor growing older with absolute dignity. The truth was an isolated man reflecting on the massive emotional cost of his own success. He gained the entire world, but sacrificed the only sanctuary that kept him grounded in reality. The greatest love story of his life happened long before Hollywood ever learned his name. And Hollywood was the exact weapon used to execute that love. The tragedy of absolute fame is that it creates an impenetrable wall of isolation, leaving the idol completely cut off from the genuine human connection they need to survive. Lola was the only witness to his true self, and the studio machine ensured she was pushed completely out of the frame. Those worn brass keys did not just open a cheap apartment from the late 1950s. They unlocked the final era where Robert Redford was entirely real. They became a heavy, rusted reminder of the exact moment the studio system slaughtered his ordinary life to birth a god. The keys represented a bloody sacrifice on the altar of American entertainment. Does securing immortality on film always require sacrificing the actual life playing out behind the lens? You have seen the dark reality operating behind the most famous smile in cinematic history. Join the investigation and subscribe to uncover the buried secrets the golden age of Hollywood still desperately tries to hide.